Right, we invite first proposition here.
Can everyone see and hear me?
Yep, thanks.
Okay, great. So once again, before I start, please ask me verbal POIs because I'm not going to be looking at the chat. I'll start it. Wait, I'm so sorry. My timer is acting buggy. Okay, never mind. There we go. All right. Okay, starting my speech in three, two, and one. We exist in an era where the disparity between the rich and the poor continues to grow, not just within nations, but between nations as well. A powerful institution like the World Bank, which represents global cooperation and which aims to solve global injustices and things like poverty, exemplifies this issue in the status quo. What does the current system look like? The current system of voting in the World Bank implements a two-tiered approach. That's to say that they have two ways in which they allocate countries' votes. The first is a basic system where every country is gained an equal amount of votes just on the scope of membership. But secondly, is this more share-based system, which means that a country gets each additional vote based on the amount of economic contributions that they do to the World Bank. So they get one vote for each share of capital stock held. This structure inherently gives countries with larger contributions, hence wealthier nations, more power in the decision making. The United States, for instance, possesses 16.37% of the total votes, significantly more than any other single country. What is our proposal in today's debate? We propose a one country, one vote system by the World Bank Group. This means that each country, regardless of their economic contribution to the World Bank, is going to have one vote. How are the decisions going to be made in this new in this new form of voting? We say that there's likely going to be a simple majority for all the decisions. So the projects to approve, the loans, and basic such things, there's going to be like a simple majority. But in other more important decisions like appointment of a new president or like modifications to the agree like policies of agreement, we think that a critical majority of the two-thirds of the population or the total members is something that we are ready to do. So how do we think we're going to facilitate this change? One strategic note here that you need to realize is that the West and powerful countries that have a stake in the World Bank and that have a lot of voting power in the World Bank and the status quo actively seek this change in the World Bank structure. This is because of a few reasons. First is the existence of predatory loans like Chinese, like other more appealing loans that these countries could take. This looks like China in the status quo. It presents a low barrier alternative for development that is a credible threat the West wants to counterbalance, right? And there's a few reasons for this. Firstly, when China gives developing countries a low barrier alternative for development, what is going to happen is that poorer countries or developing nations that don't want to adhere to a lot of the policies that come with the World Bank loans are more likely going to take this. They ensure, but the problem with Chinese loans is that they are unsustainable and overwhelm poor countries, forcing them to cede strategic advantage to China, strategic leverage to China. There's a lot of examples of this in the status quo. It's not just Sri Lanka, but you know about it, right? China basically gave Sri Lanka a lot of loans, and what this transformed to was them basically having control over their ports, like in the status quo, right? But there's also places like Kenya, Zambia, and Laos, where basically after these countries defaulted on debt, China now has a leverage where they're in a position where they can actively, like due to the inability of these countries to pay their loan back, ask for strategic resources. That is to say that they could take control of ports. They've done this in many instances, these are not just isolated example. China has been exploiting poor nations. Now, you can't just come up here and tell me that, okay, developing countries have a brain as well. They're not going to take Chinese loans because developing countries are desperate. They're trying to do projects that are going to save their people, right? This often comes from a lot of public force and this comes from a lot of aspiring leaders, which means that number one, they have an incentive to actively take loans and make projects first for their democratic and like political image. But secondly, even the public is like forcing them to do a lot of projects. So they're very likely going to take loans from institutions that offer them loans, right? So the essential framing and key framing here is that these countries are desperate and want loans. And when China provides them a lot of loans, they're probably going to take it. But what they don't realize is this exploitative. Now, the main impact here is that China is now going to have a lot of strategic control over a lot of places in the world. This could look like geopolitical and military control. This could look like control in the form of ports, which directly affects trade, which means that the West has an active incentive to not let China do these things. Therefore, we think that the powerful countries in the West and the World Bank currently are probably going to, allow for this democratic process and allow for representation to transform, because this is something that is going to uphold a lot of democracy. This is something that is going to give developing countries more rights in the World Bank, which means that they're more likely going to stick to this, given that they're now going to be able to form better policies. Before moving on to my arguments, are there any questions? Is on democratic equity, and secondly, we argue on restorative justice for historical injustices. Firstly, then, on democratic equity, the World Bank, like any international organization, ought to reflect the principles of democracy and equal representation, principles which are notably absent from its current voting structures. I want to give you a preemption here, right? Even if you believe that probably people that contribute more to an organization should have more say in it, the World Bank is not just a for-profit and normal organization. It is a non-profit organization and almost a charity aiming to actually help people, aiming to bring developing countries out of poverty. Therefore, here we don't think the entire idea that contributors should gain the most benefit applies, given their main goal and the way in which the organization advocates itself and shapes itself. So how do we uphold democratic equity? Like before that though, like the countries in the World Bank currently, while individually, like small countries, while individually contributing less, collectively make up a significant portion of the World Bank's membership. That is to say that there's a lot of people that are going to be affected by its policies, but they still make up a very small amount of it. The US has 16%, for God's sake, and other countries have like 0.1%, when collectively they're probably going to make population 10 times the size of the United States and still not going to have a voting power that is like 10% of the United States. Therefore, we think that this is inherently unfair. How do we uphold democratic equity? We think that at a point where these organizations are participating with the World Bank, are subject to the World Bank's policies, and have vested interest in the World Bank, they should be allowed a say. Why isn't this happening in the status quo? This is largely because the current system, due to the inherent voting power of large bodies, has basically allows countries to consolidate their power and basically perpetuate a cycle of unequal representation. Weighing this argument, right, the adoption of a one country, one vote system is a necessary step towards democratic equity in the World Bank. Because as long as we don't do that, powerful countries like the United States and Japan are still going to have a lot of say that is going to go against these developing nations. Now, this say transforms in a few reasons, right? And this is harmful because number one, they're probably going to look at things like opening up markets overtly. That is to say that they're going to prioritize multinational companies, which is going to benefit their economies, but that causes death of internal and domestic production, things as such. They're probably going to solely focus on the non-environmental aspects of things. That is to say, like the building of the dam in India, the pipelines in Chad. These are very good examples of how the World Bank has done projects that have harmed developing countries in the past, right? Therefore, we think that the harms of this are very apparent. Therefore, we think that we need democratic equity. This is the only way in which we can guarantee that people are getting the development that they ask for, and not just some global scheme that allows their entire country to fail. Secondly, then, on historical imbalances and restorative justice, right? The context of this argument is that most countries in the status quo are very dependent on the World Bank money for a few reasons. Firstly, because it's low interest, but secondly, also because this is probably one of the only form of the loans that they have access to, right? So the World Bank basically in this instance becomes an institution that is allowing these nations to develop and like one of the only institutions that these nations have access to take low interest loans, which is going to allow them to develop. Now, one major framing that you want to notice here is that these countries are poor for a reason. God did not just say, okay, these countries are going to be poor and these countries are going to be rich and form the world, right? There's a few ways in which this manifested. This was through historical disbalances, due to historical exploitation. Look at Britain. It exploited India. It exploited a lot of different places. You have to note that the former Britain colonies that are broke due to the Britain actively exploiting it are now poor and face harms because of it, but they don't have voting powers as equal to Britain, which means that they're not able to make changes. We think that this is inherently unfair. The current system perpetuates harm. They took away money from people. They are the very reason that they're poor, and now they're not allowing them to make decisions because they are poor. It doesn't really make sense to me, right? This is a very predatory form of a voting system. This is not fair at all. Therefore, panel, we think that this is just not a tokenistic idea, right? This is something that is going to present real life changes for a better world, for better donations, for less predatory practices. Vote proposition.
Okay, we thank the first proposition for their speech and now invite the first opposition speaker to open their team's case.
Am I audible and visible?
Yes, thanks.
Perfect. So I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Say I'm a developing country. I'm looking for a large amount of capital to build a hydroelectric dam, a nuclear power plant, or some expensive project to improve the lives of my citizens. Unfortunately and surprisingly, commercial banks systematically refuse large loans to developing countries or grant them with such a high interest that only a fool would accept them. This is done for both legitimate and also illegitimate reasons, but that's beside the point, because fortunately those developing countries will actually be able to get those loans from the World Bank, because the World Bank offers billions of funding for those ambitious projects yearly at low interest and with various favorable conditions in case this developing country defaults on its loan. So because we know how such a scenario will end, because we care for this real future of those developing countries, we oppose this motion. So in my speech today, I will mainly be doing 3 things: rebuttal, case claim, and give up some of our substantives. So before all, I want to point out a big misconception and contradiction that the proposition has been given us today, which is first how actually we do have those low interest loans within the World Bank, saying that actually those developing countries, they will care about those loans, they will want them, and what the decisions that are going to be made within this World Bank group is actually going to affect them. So saying that actually those developing countries are going to be going to and needing and using those loans. However, in the same time, saying that those developing countries, because of the system, are going to drop out of taking loans from those and going to evil China, because surprisingly they won't see the problems, because surprisingly they are stupid enough to do so. So what did the proposition say to us today? They mainly gave up 2 points. First, saying how this is how those countries are going to be now going to some evil loaners like China. And you know what, we do agree that going and taking such loans may be harmful, but we tell you that this is not going to be this is only going to be happening in their world, and we are going to be emphasizing on that on our second speech. But why we think that this is not going to be happening in our world, because simply it is not. We are in the status quo, and we see, as you stated, that those developing countries are still going to this World Bank, because you know what, they do give less. Currently, they do give lower interest rates. We also tell you that if there has been problems, this World Bank is actually learning. They're not just, we don't see the insensitives. Why this World Bank will be just all of a sudden and newly going to change their way of doing. And out of that, they're going to be switching out rules that the developing countries are not going to be able to keep up with anymore. They also then talked about it is unfair, and they gave up some absurd arguments about how it is just the amount of votes from here, from like all those countries, and there is not the same. But what we tell you is, look, it is proportional. So the math that you have been trying, that you were trying to do here, is just wrong. Sorry, it is proportional. So if a group of countries give up the same amount as the US, they would have had the same voting power. They then
Question, ma'am.
of how there has been this historical exploitation and how this is just unfair now. But what we tell you is that, look, if it is about if being unfair means to help those people, those countries, if being unfair means to be able to get this money to actually be able to develop, then yes, let it be unfair. So moving on to that, what our case, what we will be saying in our case today is that we will prove to you how there will be just more bad decision within their work, how there is going to be less funding, and that even if those two don't happen, how decision making will still going to be within developed countries' hands, and how there is going to be just less accountability. Those 2 points are going to be proven by our second speaker. And moving on to our substantive. So it is important to say that, you know what, the decisions that are being made by those votes are very important decisions. Okay, they're very technical, requiring scientific and financial expertise. So one country, one vote means that every country, regardless of their expertise, will have an equal say. And so we not having the status quo, because it's different, because the countries do have this large power of with largest voting power have good financial expertise. Why do we think that those developed countries that do have in the status quo this largest voting power do have more financial expertise? Because of the basis on which they have this largest voting power is actually their involvement into
Question, ma'am.
into the no thank you their involvement into the World Bank. And what we tell you is that yes, if you do have more money, if you give more money to the World Bank, you are more likely to have expertise, because you were able to actually get to that place. Because we think that to get to that place, you do need this kind of expertise. Not to say that other opinions actually will not other opinions will not matter. Okay, they will still have their say, but it's not going to be as much as the countries that are going to be given the most money. So what will that mean in the world? It means that we are going to be having poor decisions being made. And what will lead to? It will lead to misallocation of funds. Countries will be in need may not receive the funding, and even if they do, it will be and inefficient, leading to failing projects, misalignment. Because you know what, the core goal of the World Bank would be decided by countries with no stakes in funding, leading to some skewed priorities. Moving on to our second argument, stating that actually we are going to be having less funding, whether it is because we do have bad decision making, whether it is just because, you know what, the funds are being supplied by those developed countries, and those developed countries have a pragmatic and moral reason for giving those lands. If they don't have a say proportional to their contribution, those countries will have less of an incentive to lend this capital, not just because they will see how bad of a decisions this World Bank will be taking, but also because, you know what, it is just this insensitive of believing that you are the one that have the right strategy. And if you are giving this money, you do want to be able to protect it, to be able to forge it, and to be able give it and have a power over it. So what will that mean? It will mean underfunding. Underfunding meaning that countries will not be receiving the capital they need, leading to a vicious circle of poverty, and less funding for ambitious projects that advance the goal of the World Bank. But also we will have what the proposition have been fearing so much today, which is actually that when those countries will not be able to take the money from this World Bank, because there will be no more money in the World Bank, those developed countries will be able to go to those abusive lenders like China and have all the impact that you have already did. Thank you. So in conclusion, judges, debaters, audience, the verdict is now clear. Team opposition is actually guilty. Guilty of what you asked, guilty of falling into this delusional patterns of prioritizing some superficial display of fairness over efficacy. So, however, the worst offense is the following: wishing for a future where countries remain in poverty, where entrepreneurs abort their dreams due to lack of money, where your ambitions and dreams remain vacant vessels, unfinished blueprints, and a sad word proposition.
All right, I thank that speaker very much for their speech, and now invite second proposition to continue their team's case.
Hold on. She just texted me. Looks like she's having problems again. This is really bad timing. I'm so sorry, guys.
All good.
Hi, sorry for keeping everyone waiting. Can I confirm that everyone can see me and hear me?
Yes, you're good. So whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you. Just a reminder, she, her pronouns, and I don't really have a POI preference. You could either unmute or give me a chat POI. Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two areas of responses in this speech. Firstly, on which side is the World Bank better? Secondly, on which side are developing countries better off? After that, I'll give a quick extension on the impact of our principle. Firstly, then, first question, on which side is the World Bank better? There were two things that opposition says here. Firstly, on decision making, secondly, on funding. Firstly, on decision making, then they tell you that developing countries will probably developing countries still make the rules on both sides, and this is something that they concede to. But after conceding, they then tell you that, oh, but there's going to be bad decision making because if these people are not in positions of power, they're probably not going to be making the best decisions, and like democratic decisions are not the best decisions, right? But notice that we're talking about the World Bank here, which is to say that that is an institution that probably has a very good mechanism as to making good decisions, right? They probably have like economists, lawyers, financial people appointed in positions of power to make sure that the decisions that they're making are correct. The distinction then is that the passing of these bills, the passing of these policies were previously in the hands of these really powerful developed countries, whereas now every single country in the world is likely to have an equal say in decision making. We think then that bad decisions are not likely to be made, because notice that my first speaker tells you that these developing countries are still a part of the World Bank. So given that there's a bad decision that is made, we think that that is also likely to affect them, given that they are also a member. But also these developing countries are the people that put in the funds, right? So they're not going to just make stupid decisions which are going to lead to them going in a loss.
Point of information.
Their own money that they are spending. But secondly, then on funding, they say that but the rich, powerful countries are going to have like less incentive to fund. So let's really engage here. Why do we think that countries like Japan and US and other Western and non-Western powers will stick around? It is really difficult to create the same network and infrastructure as the World Bank. And my first speaker highlights this in his speech. We don't really get a response. We told you that it's really hard for any country in the world to make like diplomatic relations, international relations, as much as you can make inside of the World Bank, right? That is because like they will still want the World Bank to carry on its good work for the sake of their own economy. The US literally benefits from the dollar transactions that happen through the World Bank, and the trade enables through economic growth caused by the World Bank. But even if wealthier nations threaten to pull funding, it is not guaranteed that they will follow through with this threat. The potential backlash from the international community, the damage of their global reputation may deter from this, because notice that people within these living within these countries, and they cannot just say, oh, but like these powerful countries control media, so there's not going to be backlash, right? Because I'll give you a reason why there is going to be backlash. Firstly, we think that people living within these democracies are probably really skeptical of the things that their government does because of the kinds of confidence that people don't have on their government. But secondly, we think that the largely developing nations are the people that the world is actively catering to, which is to say that if they really pull out the funding, we think that they're just going to get a large backlash and that is just not worth it. But let's take our worst case scenario. Let's say that these countries pull funding. Why do we think that we are still better off? We think that the World Bank can sustain itself in the long run, like short run, because it probably has some money in the funding. But over the long run, we think that it can sustain itself through loan repayments, as most money it gives are loans, right? This may require loans to be made more cautiously, and we concede to that. And we think that is actually a good thing, because the biggest reason why countries cannot pay back loans is because of economic mismanagement. A lot of countries require more scrutiny, and we think that when World Bank adopts by seeking and when the World Bank becomes more cautious as to which funding that they are giving out, we think that they're likely to choose the countries that will be able to pay the money back, or at least the countries that are better regulated, right? This is actually a good thing, because our countries will now be incentivized to better their economies, to make better decisions in order to get this funding. My first speaker tells you that countries are desperate for loan, but this is also contested by opposition. They tell you that, oh, but that's really contradictory, because you say that they're desperate for loans, so why would they say, like, why would these developing countries not continue to rely on the World Bank and things like that? We think that, like, when you are so desperate for loan, like, a lot of these countries in the States know that China has a lot of exploitative schemes, but they still give into that because you need money to run your economy. Your country is going to shut down if you don't get these loans, right? So we think that these are very crucial to the point where countries are okay with being exploited in order to get this loan. World Bank, in the other hand, is probably an organization that gives you low interest loans, so you have an incentive. But notice that when their democratic will is not respected, in the long run, we believe that the World Bank can continue to lose its prevalence. So in order to have its prevalence, we think that this policy is going to benefit World Bank as a whole. So we think that we uniquely take this clash on which side the World Bank is better. Because not only do we tell you that this is, but on the other side, they're okay with that. Yes.
Why if the countries are gonna go out and go to China, for example?
Yeah, there are some countries that are doing it. And we think that in the future, there's going to be more countries that are going to opt into these schemes. To prevent that, we need to bring this policy in place, right? That is the mechanism that we're following. But before I tell you that the World Bank can also adopt by seeking external resources of funding, right? Such as increasing contributions from middle economic countries that are not really contributing right now because they don't have that democratic say within the World Bank. These middle income countries will probably be willing to contribute more when they know that they have a bigger say than before. Let's move on to second clash then. Which side are developing countries better off? And this is where we largely win this debate, because opposition has really not contested on the things that we tell you. We think that these developing countries that are in positions of power, they're usually countries that run a lot of things such as SAPs that trap the economies of these developing countries, which further affects them, right? The US probably will still have a lot of influence in decision making, but the difference under our world is that the other countries can at least reject these decisions that US probably makes. This is where our principles come in. Firstly, my first speaker tells you that the democratic will needs to be respected, because the World Bank is not a corporation that is trying to earn profit, is a not-for-profit organization that uniquely exists to benefit these developing countries, which means that we think that their say is really an important thing. But also notice that the majority of countries that are within the World Bank are developing nations, which is to say that we think that their voice needs to be uniquely heard, given that they're the large majority of countries that are present. But let's talk about the impacts of our second argument, about the principles of restorative justice. We tell you that these countries that are in positions of power right now probably gain this position through the capital that they acquired through things such as colonialism, right? We think that was unjust historically, and we think that the current weighted voting system at the World Bank unfortunately perpetuates this historical inequality. It upholds a system in which the nations that benefited from imperialism and colonialism continue to have an outsized influence on international economic decisions. For example, the UK has much greater proportion of the voting power than the countries that it colonized in the past. India, Bangladesh, and other British colonies in Asia and Africa. We think that this is inherently an injustice injustice to these countries. And this is not just a abstract issue, but one that impacts the lives of real and daily lives of millions of people in these developing nations. The decisions made by these World Bank can determine the policies, growth, and development trajectory of these nations. On our world, we think that we provide a vehicle for restorative justice. By shifting to our voting system, we begin to rectify historical injustices by ensuring that each country, regardless of its economic status, has an equal voice in decision-making processes. Given all these reasons, we also win the clash on which side are developing countries better vote proposition.
All right, I thank that speaker very much for their speech and now invite second opposition speaker.
I will start my speech in 3, 2. Before that, I prefer my POS verbally, and then I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. In this debate, we have seen that proposition has given us a very big assumption since the very start of this debate. Since the very start of this debate, they have told us how China is the country that countries were turned to. If we keep going by status quo, if we keep going by the weighted vote system, we fundamentally disagree with this assumption. In my speech today, I will be doing 2 things. First, rebuttal and rebuilding, and then second, the final argument of our case, which pertains to accountability. So starting with rebuttals, which I will start from the very first points given to us in proposition case. First, they told us that developing countries are desperate and they are very likely to take exploitative loans from China, and that the West has an incentive to not let this happen. Moreover, they also tell us that these loans will be taken from China if we don't switch to the system of one country, one vote. First off, we think that the World Bank organization has had enough history to show that this is very much unlikely. It is very much unlikely that the system that has been going on for years now, for decades now, will simply stop existing just from a day to another, will simply stop existing because these countries suddenly choose to go to China, which has, as you also said, more exploitative loans, more abusive loans with conditions that actually, with conditions that are very abusive to
Point.
To rebut this, no, I will not take it. To rebut this, I will be giving 2 points. First, undeveloped and developing countries have little care about who is dictating the terms or loans as long as they get the loan at the best conditions possible. So having an equal say when they don't have the necessary expertise to make good use of funds based on certain guidelines is not important enough for them to turn to China for non-transparent, abusive, exploitative loans as opposed to fully transparent and low interest loans by the World Bank organization. Second point to make here is that the only reason underdeveloped and developing countries turn to China is that the World Bank organization is suddenly incapable or unwilling to give loans where needed. And both of these cases do happen in Proposition 12. As our first speaker showed to you, when big contributors suddenly find themselves a powerless entity in an institution they're funding and keeping afloat, only to find the reins to give the reins of power in the hands of a group of financially incapable, void of expertise countries, the perception that things will definitely go wrong will push them to pull out of the World Bank group. Proposition pushes against this by saying that pulling out will lead to backlash. But we think that seeing their funds being misused and going to places where they're not supposed to go and squandered is a bigger incentive to leave than a temporary backlash could ever be for staying in the World Bank organization. But then even if these countries somehow don't pull out, bad decisions will be made. Again, proposition pushes against that by saying that these decisions will actually be better since it'll be made by a majority of countries. It is like giving a bunch of children the big decision of choosing things that are beyond them, choosing things that are beyond them, such as when to study, whether no, I'll not take that. Whether they will be going to school, whether they will be doing this and that. Important decisions giving them to these children because they have the majority of vote instead of the people that are actually responsible, instead of the people that are actually given the funds and that have the incentive for making these things work, and that most importantly have the expertise and have the experience in international institutions to make sure that these funds are not squandered, that these funds go where they are supposed to go, and that they are not misused, and that they are put in projects where needed. But then finally, they also give us the point of democratic equity, and they tell us how the World Bank Organization is a nonprofit, and that the weighted vote system doesn't make sense because actually it is against the very principles of the World Bank Organization, and that a lot of developing countries countries in the World Bank Organization are developing or underdeveloping ones, and that it is harmful because it focuses solely on non-environmental projects and how countries are poor because of historical imbalances, giving us the example of Britain exploiting India. Again, one point to rebut this. First off, Britain exploiting India, Britain exploiting India was not done through the World Bank Organization, but through the colonization of India by Britain. So this example is actually irrelevant in our debate. But then to rebut the actual core of the argument, how the weighted vote system is against these principles. The principles of the World Bank organization are very simple. One, make sure that underdeveloped and developing countries do get better conditions of living, and that the people there get better conditions of living and live an actual decent life. This will not be made by making sure that the majority of the majority of countries that do not have expertise make decisions that are very relevant to the people on the ground. So here we are just feeding into this assumption that giving this power to the majority of countries which do not have expertise, will somehow make things better, when we give you clear mechanism of how we will have bad decision making in propositions world, because there is no expertise, because there is no experience on the part of these underdeveloped and developing countries. Now, now that I'm done with rebuttal and rebuilding of our case, I will move on to the final argument of our case, which is accountability. Now, in this argument, we will play, again, in proposition playground, and yes, I will take that.
What do you think is better, a fragile democracy or a monarchy with a benevolent leader?
Can you repeat this, POI, please?
What do you think is better, a fragile democracy or a monarchy with a benevolent leader?
I think I understand where you want to get that at with this argument, that you're simply saying that the World Bank Organization is somehow an autocratic, you're comparing to simply an autocratic government as opposed to your world, which is supposed to be the fragile democracy. Well, what we are going to tell you here is that the choice and the contribution of in the World Bank Organization is the thing that makes sure, and the expertise is what makes sure that these countries have the most say. So no, we are not compared to an autocratic government here. We are compared to a technocratic government where we give the power to the people who are most experienced. So here we will actually ask this question to you: what do you prefer, giving the power to people that have the most experience, or to a bunch of people who don't know what they are doing? So moving on with my argument. In this argument, we'll play proposition playground, and we'll assume one final time, suppose that whatever was said earlier isn't convincing enough and will not actually happen. So even if big contributors don't pull out, and even if they are too honest to say, there still stays the issue of accountability. Bad decisions will be made if every coming country gets to have a say in matters that, one, do not affect them, and two, they don't have enough experience and expertise to deal with. In status quo, a lot of the voting power is held by developed countries such as the US and Japan. They have a lot of scrutiny directed on them as the main actors in the organization. This means that these big countries have a big say when projects are being decided, meaning the sum to lend or the way to implement the project and guidelines for paying back the debt in a way that won't destroy every economic benefit, is something that is put on them. But the blame, if something fails, not only do they have a vested interest in the success of the project, but the blame and responsibility will be directed on them for oversights in decision making. This builds accountability, which is not present on proposition side, because public scrutiny is not directed on some specific actors, but on the majority. And here we have nobody to blame. We have nobody to put the responsibility on. And this is why we think that our system is the one that ultimately works. And as we have showed you, our arguments are more important because of this. Proud to oppose. Thank you.
All right, we thank that speaker very much for their speech, and now invite third prop to conclude the substantive part of their case.
All right. To make sure, am I audible and visible to everybody?
Thanks.
My POR preferences are verbal, but yeah, please, feel free to interrupt me during my speech, but please don't badger. And with this, I'd like to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. So before that, a simple piece of call out. All clearly did not deal with the most important piece of material brought from our case, which was the evident principle push we put forward about how World Bank had this responsibility to actually push for like democratic equity between richer and poorer countries, and how this particular principle was again backed by how historical imbalances was the reason actually these poorer countries were poor and these richer countries were rich, and how this particular principle required a lot more attention from their side, right? So now moving on to responses. Number one, the first point they made was decision making would require technical and scientific knowledge that only developed countries possessed, so they would have like better say for it, right? So the response to this is in like two layers. But before that, again a call out. It is rather assumptuous that these developing countries do not have people of expertise in scientific fields, and every scientist present in the world is from the Silicon Valley only. Now back to the responses. Number one, the World Bank is an organization where scientists and experts are present in the organization itself, and decisions are therefore always made with their opinions involved. We do not see as why the lack of experts in developing countries is a problem here. And number two, even if we are to concede to their assertion that lack of expertise is inherently bad to decision making, we need to acknowledge that the World Bank is a non-profit organization that was originally made to cater to poor countries. We tell you that the lack of expertise holds a lot less importance when compared to democratic equity that these poorer countries so deserve, because these countries are the ones that know the grassroots problems that exist in their country, and also as a way to redress historical imbalances brought forth by colonialism before. And number two, what do they say? They say that why would developing countries adopt these predatory Chinese loans when they know that they are predatory, right? Two layers to this again. Number one, we characterize by saying that these developing countries are desperate countries that want loan, because most or like almost all countries have a budget greater than their revenue, and they require a low cost debt, right? China provides loans at a very cheaper rate, and therefore this is already an incentive to developing countries, because the World Bank does have agency over where these countries actually use the loan they take from the World Bank due to the SAPs they enforce under their contracts, right? Now, number two, additional analysis to this. The World Bank has the ability to negotiate which sector these countries actually spend their loans in. Example, like welfare, infrastructure, health, education, and thereby impacting the economic planning of this country, right? The World Bank loans come with structural conditions that impose certain restrictions on countries, right? This means that the World Bank can have control over how certain economic spending is carried out within economies. These countries want more agency over how they use their funds. Due to this reason, we tell you how they're much more likely to like fall into these predatory Chinese loans. Now moving on to clashes. So firstly was on the incentive structure that developed countries like the US or Japan had to sustain their funding in the World Bank, right? They simply just gave assertion it by telling us that developed countries would not have incentives to fund the World Bank because they do not get proportional decision-making powers. We dynamically dealt with this assertive push with two layers of structured reasons. Number one, it is difficult to create the same network and infrastructure as the World Bank. They will want the World Bank to carry on its good work for the sake of their economy, right? We also talk about how the United States actually benefits from the dollar transactions that happen through the World Bank and the trade enabled through economic growth caused by the World Bank, right? And even if wealthier nations threaten to pull funding, it is not guaranteed that they will follow through with this threat, because there's potential like backlash from the international community and damage to their global reputation, which may deter them from actually jumping into these actions, right? So number two, we also dealt with the worst case where these countries actually reduce funding. The World Bank can still sustain itself through loan repayments, was something that we reiterated, as most money it gives is loans. This may require loans to be like made much more cautiously, which is again, we told you, was a good thing, since the biggest reason why countries cannot pay back loans is due to like economic mismanagement, as pointed out by a second speaker, right? A lot of these countries require much more scrutiny, is what we said. The World Bank can also adapt by seeking, alternative sources of funding, such as like increased contributions from middle income countries, private sector investments, or even issuing bonds on international financial markets. These middle income countries will be willing to contribute more when they know that they have a bigger say than before. this is a certain incentive that exists uniquely on our side only, which the op failed to consider, right? And even if the World Bank like shrinks a bit, there's competition in the world market, such as BRICS Bank, that enables a healthy competitive market for like government debt, which enables countries to take loans at a healthy rate. Right now, the World Bank dominance has created a high barrier to entry globally, right? And even though BRICS Bank and other regional banks exist, they're smaller, and countries backing them have no incentive to expand because competing with the World Bank is really difficult. And we tell you as to why this is so important, like why it is so important for the World Bank to actually step up and actually, prevent the countries from actually, stepping into these predatory loans. Yeah, sure. Before like going on to the next clash, I'd like to take the point.
So, some of the complex derivatives being traded in the loans require PhDs in mathematics and physics, when many of these developing countries, which will get a say in your world, don't even have 10% of their population enrolled in higher education.
Well, I believe to make actual decisions work, only 2 or 3 experts are necessary. And therefore, we tell you that these experts already exist on the bank, right? I doubt the other side has understood the implications of this. World Bank is a non-profit organization that works for, global benefit, right? When we when we characterize World Bank that way, we say that these experts that are currently in the bank do not have any biases towards certain countries, right? So therefore they have the incentive to actually work and therefore give advice to these underdeveloped countries who you claim to have no experts at all, which we again believe to be assumptions. So having that out of the way, number 2 on decision making, right? So first, the only point they had on this was no expertise present in underdeveloped countries. Another baseless argument that came from there. What do we really tell you? We tell you that the principle of democratic equity exists, and therefore this is something that is far greater when it comes to the when we talk about the responsibility of a altruistic bank such as the World Bank, which needs to cater to like certain needs of these poorer countries, right? And we also tell you that experts are actually indeed present in these countries, and therefore all of the experts that they talk about aren't just existing in developed countries only, right? This is something that they fail to impact more on, and therefore this is something that we clearly take. So how could the op have clearly won? The path to victory for op could have been simple, and it could have been simply by dealing with the principal push a lot better, by telling us as to why democratic equity was a lot lesser important in context of this particular debate, right? So when I'm like actually comparing the world is simply a world where they simply deny the harms the World Bank currently poses, such as disproportionate power and the way World Bank has caused very predatory projects that have harmed developing countries such as Chad and India, and not telling us as to why their side really brought the best out of World Bank and therefore actually put forth their altruistic values, right? However, on our side, our world with our conceded impacts is a world where democratic equity is maintained and the historical imbalances are corrected way better, and therefore these poorer countries benefit a lot more and therefore fare better in the economic market, right? Due to all these reasons, propose. Thank you.
I thank that speaker very much for their speech. Now invite third opposition to conclude the substantive side of their case.
Audible, visible?
Yes, thanks.
Great. I will set my timer. I will start in 3, 2, 1. So in this debate, I have been rather disappointed by the fact that despite Team Nepal's excellent debating skills, their argumentations displays a vacuousness, a shallowness, a lack of substance. Like say, a bone marrow that you break with the promise of a nutritious bone marrow inside, but upon breaking it, you find nothing inside. These are not empty words, for I will prove to you in my third speech why the points made on their side show and display the victory of team opposition. This will be done through a few things. First of all, rebuilding our team's case. Then secondly, rebutting some of the arguments they've made. Then concluding with a summary that will show you that victory belongs to team opposition. So first of all, what have they said to counter our points, and how do we counter those points? So they first say that within their world, you have good decision-making, since there are panels of lawyers, panels of experts that are out there making the decisions. Now, this shows a lack of understanding on how the World Bank actually works, which is that in your situation, much of the votes, which are done on country assistance strategies, on core goals, on loans, on restructuring payments, are done by the countries themselves. Hence, in your world, these decisions will not be made by this panel of experts that you've somehow invented, but by these countries, some of which are in desperate need of funding, some have not taken, and the first minute has not started, some of which have a very bad financial expertise, hence they cannot possibly make good decisions. This is, in your world, it is a functionally democratic and not technocratic functioning. Then, they say that the World Bank will not lose prevalence within their world because there is a need for diplomacy. Once again, this also shows a lack of research, considering that diplomacy and international relations already have very stable institutions in place, such as the United Nations. And to add, they say that, yes, there won't be less funding within their world because there is a risk of backlash, a risk of damage to global reputation, given the example of the United States of America, when the United States of America is actually a unilateralist country which operates purely on pragmatic benefits and usually does not consider the opinion of the international community, see it as a storm operation and other such historical precedents. So then they speak about economic mismanagement, that our side promotes economic mismanagement. And because of this, you have desperate countries rushing towards the Bank of China to get these loans. And we think that's rather wrong, and in fact actually helps illustrate why team proposition illustrates a better world for these developing nations, since many of the policies, many of the country assistance strategies put in place under the current system help restructure the economy in such a way that there is less corruption, that there is more funding towards the sectors that actually need it, say education, say energy, say healthcare, meaning there is less economic mismanagement in place than a scenario, a status quo, actually an alternative status quo where decisions are being made by countries that don't have the necessary expertise to put them, and thus will much more promote this financial mismanagement that you speak of. With that in mind, I would also like to move now to some rebutting of the arguments made by the other side. So the first speaker went on a long tangent about China without illustrating how one vote, one country system will actually reduce predatory loans given by China to developing nations. So we think that this is symmetrical and should not be tackled, since predatory loans take place in both worlds, and we've just illustrated them taken.
Second speaker clearly told you that at a point where they have democratic voting rights, they're going to stay with the World Bank for longer, which means that we did show you why countries would not take predatory loans.
No, they're actually going to stay longer on our current system, since we've illustrated that these countries, these developed countries like the USA, say Japan, which have the largest share of votes within the World Bank, have much of an incentive to keep funding this institution within the current status quo, since they also they also can influence other countries abroad for favorable economic policies that favor them and favor these countries. It is a win-win situation. So with that in mind, I will also advance. They say that the West will allow such a change and in fact encourages it. This is incoherence, and it is inconsistent with the pragmatic policy making of the West, which seeks self-interest above all. Indeed, the World Bank is not a charity as they say, but is a complex web of diplomacy and economic networks, meaning that these countries, developing countries putting their funds, are doing it also for their own self-interest. It is a win-win situation again. They say that the World Bank should be democratic and that democratic equity surpasses the number of loans or economic benefits. Now, we think that this is missing the forest for the trees, given that, in fact, loans are the primary, loans and not democracy, like the United Nations or other institutions in place, are the primary driver of the World Bank. So what's important is not that there is democratic decision-making, but that low-income and middle-income countries are getting the funding they need for projects for hydroelectric grants, for schools, for electric grids, and for other projects that help them. And in our world, we've illustrated that this was more prevalent. And that's the most important thing. So they also went on a really short tangent about how these projects that are funded by the developed countries harm the environments. Now, this is rather contradictory with the goals of developing nations, considering that they themselves seek a right to develop without taking into account environmental factors, meaning that, in fact, the goals of the developed countries funding these nations are aligned with the goals of these developing countries receiving these loans. Why do we need a redundant democratic system when both countries, developing, lender, and borrower, already agree on core goals? They also speak about historical equality. So we think this is an idealistic argument that has no mechanism to prove, since considering that the World Bank does not concern itself with the historical colonialism and the damage done in the past by developed countries within continents such as Africa and Asia, but with loans themselves and pushing forward the economy of these countries. You say that, but you can't refute the fact that countries like Rwanda, after the Rwandan genocide, which devastated these nations, were able to get back on their feet and become a business hub today, an attractive business hub, thanks to foreign investment that was facilitated by the World Bank, thanks to very appealing loans, and thanks to the actual status quo that is currently in place. So to end, I would like to summarize our team's main arguments. First of all, we say that our opposition side presents a better world because you have countries which have very good financial expertise who are making most of the decisions in place. So this will lead to better economic outcomes. And secondly, that there is more funding because countries have more of a self-interest to fund when they can get more say in the organization. And we also say that there's accountability, since in a one country, one vote system where many countries don't have a stake in the funding, they may make decisions that are uninformed, that don't take into account the minutiae of organization within the World Bank, leading to a lack of accountability and bad decisions. They say on their side that restorative justice and democracy, these are values that are greater than economic funding, than loan funding and the current status quo of the World Bank. And we think that this has been explored through many mechanisms, and that is why we are very proud to oppose. Thank you.
All right, we thank that speaker very much for their speech. Now invite the opposition reply speaker. Here.
I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Before getting on with the Rob has led a very good case as to why a democracy is better than a dictator. They have taken this motion and, as showcased by their arguments and POIs, put it on that ground. But that is not our debate, is it? Before getting on with the clashes, let's remind you of the main stakeholders brought to you by the first opposition speaker: low-income countries and their citizens. On this base, let's analyze the points made by both sides. So in this debate, we have noticed two main clashes. First, expertise versus democratic equity, and second, accountability versus agency. Starting with the first clash, expertise versus democratic equity. Proposition tells us that among the World Bank Organization goals is to promote democracy. Well, this is besides the point, but opposition clearly told you that that was incorrect, because their main goals are: 1, end extreme poverty, and 2, promote shared prosperity in a sustainable way. But even if that were the case, opposition clearly told you that they do get a say. It might not be a big say, but it is there. And the reason that it is not big is because of the lack of expertise, because their scale of economy and involvement in world institutions is minimal at best. Proposition tells you in return that only 2 or 3 experts are needed to make these decisions, but as opposition told you, they are downgrading the importance and scale of the process to make a decision. How could you expect a country that doesn't even have the funds to provide running water and electricity to its citizens to be able to make decisions that are important to these same citizens? Now, opposition clearly wins this clash because if we are to do some bit of weighing, we do see that the benefits are better. The benefits are on a bigger scale. The benefits that opposition brings are on a bigger scale, because what they do is that they benefit the most people on the ground. They benefit the most people because these projects, when they are made by people, by countries that are expert in this field, they will benefit more people, as opposed to simply having democratic equity in an international financial institution, which will impact in no way the people on the ground. Now, moving on to the second clash, being accountability versus agency. What does proposition tell you in this clash? They tell you that it is important for these countries to have agency in what projects are being made in these countries. However, what opposition tells you is that they still have one vote, even on the proposition side. They still have one vote, and there are tons of other votes that mostly are made by low income, underdeveloped, and developing countries that, as opposition shows, you have no stake in this, and they have no incentive to make sure that the decisions, that the votes that they are giving, that the decisions that are being made are good for the country in question. This means that even the agency claim that proposition claims to have in their world actually has no ground to it. However, what opposition shows you is that, on the contrary of that, big countries, big contributors have an incentive to make these projects work. They have the incentive to make sure that their funds are not being misused. So again, opposition wins this clash, and opposition's argument work and are more important because of two reasons. First, how their impacts are more certain, while propositions is very flimsy and is unlikely to bring forth this desired outcome, and how, secondly, they bring more benefits to the most vulnerable with the weighted vote system, giving the most power to the countries who will make the better use out of it, while proposition only serves to fulfill the want to keep independent from big powers, which is impossible. Like, even if it is achieved, will only lead to degradation in living conditions for the people in underdeveloped and developing. This is the opposition ultimately wins this debate. Proud to close. Thank you.
All right, I thank that speaker very much for their speech, and now invite the prop reply speaker to conclude the debate.
Am I audible in this?
Yep, thanks.
Yep. When the World Bank grants Pakistan a loan twice the size of their last loan when the United States wants a foothold to get into Afghanistan, we don't think it's altruistic behavior. We think that is politically motivated. When the World Bank builds dams in India that displaces thousands of people, we don't think it's altruism. We think it's exploitation. Side opposition today loses for a few reasons. When we tell you that China has taken over ports in the status quo, that there are real harms to investment of China, they tell us, well, no, there isn't. Guys, Sri Lanka is not a fake country. Laos is not a fake country. These impacts are very, very real. Secondly, when we tell you that there is unfair voting and disproportionate voting, they tell me no. Guys, that is just factually untrue. The United States had 16% shares in like the share-based in the capital-based share in the IBRD. That is just factually untrue. Please respond to our model if you wanted to like say that somehow, but you couldn't really do that because it's facts. You can't change facts. We tell you that developing countries have stake, and they tell you that developing countries don't have stake, so they're going to like lose money. This is just like an assertion war. But the reason we win here as well is because we tell you that developing countries want this money. It's very easy to see when my second speaker tells you that this money is a shared resource and that everyone borrows this money. I think intuitively they care about taking loans in the future, right? This is not new substance. This is just logically thinking about whatever my second speaker said, right? Therefore, developing countries have the incentive. They're not just dumb. Some people in Nepal don't have access to running water, I agree, but I am debating with you about the issues of the world. I think that is enough to show to you that there are going to be people in my country that are able to make educated financial decisions or educated economic decisions, educated political decisions. It's just very wild when you tell me, when you compare entire countries to children making decisions over studies. That is just very, very homogenizing, like a very, very homogenizing statement. We think that is not how you debate. But thirdly, their most important contention: developing countries will leave and we will all be doomed. Three reasons from proposition and three reasons why they lose this debate. Firstly, they're going to have a lot of incentives to get from the economic incentives that they already get from the World Bank. This is literally a lot of the world, which means that at a point where they go away from the World Bank, they will probably have to form new blocks, but those things aren't really successful. You see like the cross-Atlantic bloc or the cross-Pacific bloc that the United States formed with countries like Japan, right? It didn't really work out. Now, what all of this shows you is that through analysis in my speech and my second speaker's speech, they don't want to leave because they have incentives of these countries staying in Secondly, China, they tell me that, oh, but countries don't want to get out of the World Bank because it gives you low interest. Our argument is that it's getting increasingly worse when they see policies that they don't want to implement, and when they see China who tells them, you don't have to do anything, here's some low interest loan. Of course, they're going to go to China. The reason there's not many countries is because this is a recent motive. China hasn't been functioning since Bretton Woods. That is why the World Bank has been running longer, simply because it was created earlier. Give us 20 years, this would not even be a debate, because we know that this is harmful, right? Here's what we give to you in this debate then. Firstly, we show you the harms of the current voting system. We tell you that it manifests in various kinds of harms when rich countries are able to exercise their economic and political advantages. Side opposition doesn't respond to this. They just claim that the developing countries are altruistic. I think that's not true. How do we fix it? We tell you that when they have equal votes, even if developing countries collectively can now not allow the US to veto stuff, right? It's very apparent the positive benefits of this. I don't see where opposition was getting with the fact that people are not going to be able to vote. This is just single people. Guys, a democracy doesn't work like that. Secondly, on how the World Bank is losing momentum. They have increasing policies. There's going to be competition. Again, unresponded to, they tell me that they're not going to go to China and that the harms are likely to manifest in our world. Guys, the status quo is your world. There are harms in that. I think that's like an unfair claim. But thirdly, and this I think wins us the debate regardless of whatever happened here, because even if you say that all of this was a deadlock, we still have a principal argument. Countries deserve historical redress. Yes, Britain exploited India without the existence of the World Bank, but the reason India doesn't get enough votes as the Britain, or that might be a bad example, but the reason poor countries don't get enough vote is because they are poor, and that is due to colonialization. That is the principal push here. We don't think any of that makes sense. Therefore, it's very clear vote side proposition.
All right, I thank that speaker very much for their speech, and